Well, let's jump into the material for today. Today, what we're going to be talking about, as you can see, is the question about the relationship of faith and reason in a particular sense, though. That is to say, the relationship between one kind of faith, as embodied by the Catholic Church, and one kind of reason, that is, the kind of reasoning embodied by science. So I think it's too simplistic to think of reason simply as science. We talked a little bit last time about how the view that science and science alone provides the truth is problematic because it's a kind of self-defeating idea. But even though science isn't the only kind of reasoning, I think there's no doubt that science is at least one very important kind of reasoning. Is faith opposed to reason? Or are faith and reason compatible? That's the fundamental question that this class is exploring. And some people think that faith and reason are like two fighters in a UFC match, and they are going to punch each other in the face and kick each other and choke each other out from behind. And it's going to be a total opposition from the very beginning to the very end. So this is one way people think of the relationship between faith and reason. So examples of this would be, on the one hand, someone like Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins was until recently the professor of public science at Oxford University, and he thinks that faith is opposed to reason, specifically that science is opposed to faith. And so he's a great critic of faith, a great critic of religious belief. On the other side of the equation, there is actually some people of faith who think that faith and reason are always opposed. That is to say, there's some, you might call them Protestant fundamentalists, who believe that faith and reason are in opposition, and those people choose faith over reason. So ironically, both Richard Dawkins, people like him, and people like William Jennings Bryan, both think that faith and reason are in this deadly opposition to each other. And Richard Dawkins says they're opposed, faith and reason are opposed, I choose reason. And people like William Jennings Bryan say faith and reason are opposed, and they say, I'm going to choose faith against reason. Now, today what I want to explore is one element of this discussion, and that is Christian faith against science? And as I said at the beginning of this class, we should not reduce reason to science as if the only way to be reasonable or the only way we can know anything or the only way to gain insight into matters is through the scientific method. But undoubtedly, at least I think, that science is one way, a very, very important way, in which reason explores things and discovers things and learns things. So today what I want to explore is the question, is Christian faith against science? Because if it is, then we go back to people like this. People like Richard Dawkins would say, well, I'm in favor of science, so I'm against faith. And people like William Jennings Bryan would say, well, I'm in favor of reason, or faith rather, and therefore I'm opposed to science. But is this supposition that both of these gentlemen have true? Is it true that faith and reason are opposed? Or in this case, is it true that Christian faith and science are opposed? Well, let me ask you now, without looking it up, which I'm sure you could do if everyone has Google, can you think of any current or historical examples of Catholics who are also prominent scientists? Well, there's actually quite a few examples, and I obviously am not going to begin to go through all of them, but I just want to talk about just a few. So one of them is St. Hildegard of Bingen, who is considered the founder of the scientific natural history in Germany. Another is Albert the Great, who made a lot of observations about animals and plants, mainly following Aristotle, but also conducted his own explorations. He's considered the patron saint of science. Copernicus, which was mentioned, probably the most famous example. Copernicus, as you may know, was a Catholic cleric. He had taken vows in the church, and he was the first to come up with the idea that the earth moves around the sun. Another famous example is a Jesuit, Father Christopher Clavius. And he was an interesting person who proposed the Gregorian calendar worldwide. He noted basically what happened is the old calendar was inaccurate. And so Easter was no longer in spring, it became in summer, it would even go to fall. And so basically things were all out of whack. Christmas would be in the summer. And so basically he proposed this calendar, which is still used today, which lines up so that the seasons, so that every, say, Easter, it's always spring, et cetera. And every Christmas, it's always winter. Blaise Pascal was mentioned, a famous French mathematician, a physicist, and inventor of the first calculating machine, also a very great philosopher. Blessed Nicholas Steno was one of the founders of modern geology, and he made contributions to anatomy, to paleontology, and to crystallography. Laura Marie Cateribasi is known as one of the first women professors. So her academic ability was noticed early by an archbishop who later became pope, and this archbishop became her patron in education. And so she popularized Newtonian mechanics in Italy, and at 65 was appointed to the chair of experimental physics in Bologna. Father Gregory Mendel is the founder of modern genetics. Father Angelo Secchi, another Jesuit, SJ, was one of the first scientists to state authoritatively that the sun is a star. He discovered 3 different comets. He also produced a map of the lunar crater Copernicus, and he drew some of the first color illustrations of Mars. He was also active in oceanography, in meteorology, and in physics and astronomy. You may have heard of this guy. He may be saving your life soon, at least by extension, Louis Pasteur. He is the first to discover how to vaccinate people. And 1895, he also is responsible for pasteurization of milk, another Roman Catholic. Perhaps the most distinguished of them all was Father Georges Lemaitre, who died in 1966. Here he's pictured with the famous scientist Albert Einstein. And Father Lemaitre was the one who came up with the Big Bang, the idea that the whole universe began at a certain time and expanded out from a mathematical point. And Albert Einstein actually at first rejected Father Lemaitre's views, but later, on the basis of other experiments and calculations, came to accept the view that the universe began with a Big Bang. Sir John Carew Eccles, who was a Nobel Prize winner in physiology, Gertie Corey, who was the first woman to be awarded a Nobel Prize, and Sister Marie Michael Stimson, who developed early models of DNA. Another example, Dr. Gerhard Erdt, the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, and Martin Nowak, the evolutionary theorist and director of Evolutionary Dynamics at Harvard. So why am I mentioning all these people? Well, the claim that the Catholic Church opposes science is, at least prima facie, hard to reconcile with the fact of all these extremely prominent scientists. If the church really were totally opposed to science, you wouldn't expect to find all of these very prominent scientists as practicing Catholics. Another example, Professor Brian Kent Kobilka, who received the Nobel Prize in chemistry. So obviously there are many, many, many Catholic scientists. So I want to ask you now a different question. Can you think of ways the church as an institution has supported science? So you might say, well, yes, there's Catholic scientists, but the church in itself is opposed to science, or at least doesn't support science. But can you think of any ways the church as an institution actually does support science, you might say, actively? So it wouldn't be the case simply that there are some kind of maverick Catholics that turn into scientists, but also as an institution, the church has supported scientific research. One of those ways is that the church has asked some priests and nuns to do science as their main activity, as their main mission, you might say. So priests and nuns take vows of obedience, a little bit like soldiers in the military take vows to obey their commanding officer. And so the church has actually ordered some of these priests and nuns as their mission, as their main activity, to pursue science. So we've talked already about some of those people, Father Georges Lemaitre, Gregor Mendel, and others, but there's a number of those that have done that. Now, if the church really were opposed to science, one thing the church could do is just order that no priest and no nun have anything to do with science, right? In fact, forbid them from being involved in science in any way. But in fact, what has happened is just the opposite of that. Moreover, the church has made canonized saints of some scientists. So if you thought of the pursuit of science as something evil and bad, you would not canonize and officially hold up as an exemplar people who have pursued this. Like, say, I don't know, being a hitman is a bad thing. Well, there's no patron saint of hitman. There's no hitmen who are turned into canonized saints because of their activities. But by contrast, there are a number of scientists who have been canonized as saints. Cathedrals functioned as solar observatories and were actually designed as being able to function as solar observatories. Again, if science were something the church supposes, it would be hard to understand why they do that. The church also founded universities in the 11th century, the first in Bologna, but later in the University of Paris and Oxford and others. And every university has, as part of its mission, scientific discovery. That's true of Catholic universities also in our country. So Catholic universities like the University of Notre Dame has a very distinguished department of physics and other departments of science. And of course, at LMU, which is a Catholic university also, as you may know, we have this huge, fairly new life sciences building. So if the Catholic Church opposed science, it would be really weird to oppose science and then build huge buildings for the sake of trying to figure things out scientifically. And the Pope actually has something called the Pontifical Academy of Science. And this is a picture of one of their meetings. You see Stephen Hawking there on the far right of the photo, Pope Francis there in the middle. And this academy is devoted to celebrating the greatest scientists, and they have meetings where they talk about scientific issues, etc. Again, it's very hard to think how, if you're opposed to science, you would actually honor scientists of all faiths and no faith and celebrate them and fly them to the Vatican, etc., etc. Why do you think the Catholic Church as an institution supports science in these ways? Right? What explains that? What accounts for that? I've given you quite a bit of evidence that the Catholic Church as an institution does support science by, for instance, funding scientific research, by having science as part of Catholic universities, by highlighting famous scientists as saints, and by actually giving as a mission to certain people, priests and nuns, to do science. So what explains all these moves? There have been a number of popes who've talked about evolution. So Pope Pius XII talked about evolution, and so did Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, and also Pope Francis has also talked about evolution. And basically all of these popes have said that Catholics are free, if they want to believe in evolution. That is to say, there's no contradiction, at least according to Pius XII and John Paul II, etc., between being a faithful Catholic and also believing in evolution. So it is true that there are some kinds of faith, certain kinds of Protestant fundamentalist faith, that holds that the only way to understand Genesis is to understand, say, the 7 days of creation as 7 24-hour periods. So there are certainly some Christians who hold that view. Certainly fundamentalist Protestant Christians do. But among Catholics, that actually is not the majority view. So there are some Catholics who held that, like St. Ambrose. But most Catholics, like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. John Paul II, etc., have held that we ought not to understand Genesis in that way. The answer to the question of why the church has this attitude towards science is grounded in a deeper attitude. And that is an attitude about the relationship between faith and reason. So at the very beginning of today's class, I talked about the view that faith and reason are opposed, that faith and reason are like in a huge ultimate fighting championship match, and they're going to knock each other out and try to strangle each other. But the Catholic view is that faith and reason are not opposed, but rather faith and reason are compatible. In fact, the ideal is to have a faithful reason and a reasonable faith. These two things are not in opposition to each other. This view can be found in many different authors. I'll just cite a couple. One of them is the famous African theologian, St. Augustine of Hippo. And St. Augustine said, "Let every good and true Christian understand that whatever truth may be found, it belongs to his master." The idea here that Augustine is putting forward is that all truth comes from God, including scientific truth, including historical truth, including the truth that we can find in art or in poetry. All truth, at least on Augustine's view, ultimately comes from God. And since truth cannot contradict truth, the person of faith has nothing to fear from investigations in science or in history or in any field. Because if what is discovered is really true, then at least for Augustine, it ultimately comes from God. Now, this view was later expressed by, centuries later, by another thinker, Thomas Aquinas. And he put this insight in the following way. He said, every truth without exception, whoever may utter it, is from the Holy Spirit. So the idea here is that whatever truth is uttered, whoever utters it, is ultimately from God. So whether that truth is a truth found in physics or in biology or in chemistry or uttered by a thinker in the East or in the West, in the North, in the South, if it's really true, then ultimately its source is God. So the Catholic Church, in other words, has this sort of confidence that all truth comes from God. The truth of faith comes from God, and the truth of science and reason also comes from God. So there's no worry that we're going to be in contradiction to each other. Now, I've talked a lot about the Catholic Church and science, but let me ask you a different question. When and how do you think this idea of a huge conflict between faith and science arose? Where did this come from, this idea that there's a huge conflict between faith and science? The famous authors, John William Draper and Andrew Dickinson White, came up with this kind of conflict thesis. And their view was that the Catholic Church was putting down science and getting in the way of science. And this book became very popular, especially at a time when there were many immigrants to the United States from Ireland and elsewhere that were Catholic. And as you probably know from your history, these immigrants were not very warmly received, you might say, by the local inhabitants. In fact, the school I went to for an undergraduate was Boston College. And one of the reasons it was founded is that Harvard University wouldn't allow Catholics to go to it. So Catholics had to start kind of their own school so that Catholic people could get a college education. And this anti-Catholic prejudice illustrated here in this cartoon. So you see the crocodiles coming to eat the children, and the crocodiles have on the miters of bishops. You can see they're kind of crocodile/bishops. So kind of dehumanizing these people. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see these terrible Irish Catholics dropping children to be eaten by the crocodiles. And then in another corner here, you see Lady Liberty being led off by these terrible Irish Catholics off to be hanged. So the basic idea was that, these Irish people were really bad and Catholics don't know anything and they're really stupid. And there's sort of this prejudice that blamed Irish Catholic immigrants and was very hostile to them. And out of this arose this kind of anti-Catholic view that the church is opposed to science. One of the biggest reasons historically is this case of Galileo. So you have probably heard of the case of Galileo. Galileo was condemned for his views. Now there is a lot of historical context though that's needed for understanding what happened to Galileo. It is true that he was condemned by authorities in the church. That is true. But he wasn't condemned for his scientific view that the Earth went around the sun. As I mentioned earlier in this class, that view was already promulgated earlier by a guy named Copernicus. And at the time of Galileo, there were actually many, many Catholics in good standing, including Jesuit priests, who held the exact same view as Galileo, that the Earth went around the sun. So Galileo's condemnation wasn't because he held that scientific view. Rather, he was condemned because of a couple things. One of them was that he interpreted scripture in such a way that it made his scientific views part of his scriptural interpretation. And that was condemned. And then also that he broke agreements he had about putting forward his views as hypothetical rather than as established as proven. So at the time of Galileo, it actually wasn't yet scientifically established with certainty that the Earth went around the sun. That was scientifically established later, but at the time of Galileo, it was still a disputed question. And Galileo was putting forward his views as not in a hypothetical sort of way. So the case of Galileo is definitely a case where the church came down on the wrong side and condemned, as John Paul II later said, a legitimate scientific insight. But I think it's quite unfair to say that based on this case, that therefore the church opposes science. Does my mom love me? I have more certainty about my mom loving me than pretty much anything in my whole life. Like, I know for sure she loves me. But are there some times when she's done things to me that I'm like, oh, mom, that wasn't very cool? Yeah, definitely. Right. So I'd say the same thing is true about the church's relationship to science. The church loves science. But in the 2,000-year history of the church, is there going to be a case like Galileo where the church isn't doing the right thing and is not showing love? Yeah, there is. And you can't deny it. It's true. But I think that from that one case, and even if you had other cases, it would be totally unfair to generalize from that and say, well, therefore the church is against science. Just as if I had the videotape of your mom doing one bad thing to you, it would be not very good reasoning to say, well, therefore, overall, your mom hates your guts. Well, no, I mean, that's not accurate. All right, so next time what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what I think is the most interesting case, at least in my opinion, of the church allegedly opposing science and faith and reason, and that is the case of evolution. So many people think that the story of Genesis shows a strong contradiction between faith and reason, between revelation and science. So next time we're going to look at the famous story of Genesis, the story of creation in 7 days, the story of the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve. And we're going to look at that story and consider the question, does the story of Genesis show a contradiction, an opposition between faith on the one hand and science and reason on the other hand? So that'll be next time.